Is a mistake you made 20 years ago quietly rewriting the chemistry of your brain today? It sounds like the premise of a science fiction film, but it isn't. Every time you replay an old decision, the job you didn't take, the marriage you didn't save, the words you said in anger you can never take back, your body responds as if that moment is happening right now. Your heart rate shifts, your muscles tighten. A cascade of stress hormones floods a system that was never designed to relive the past on a loop. Chronic regret isn't a metaphorical weight, it's a physiological one, and it may be accelerating the very cognitive aging you're trying to outrun. Here's the harder truth. We are remarkably generous with everyone except the person we used to be. A friend confesses an old failure, and we tell them they were young, they didn't know better, they did the best they could with what they had. But turn that same failure inward, and suddenly the rules change. Suddenly you are still on trial for a decision made by someone who biologically and psychologically no longer exists. You have grieved relationships, buried parents, changed careers, raised children, and yet somehow you have never let go of the 25-year-old, or the 35-year-old, or the 50-year-old who didn't yet have the wisdom you're using right now to judge them. Picture for a moment waking up tomorrow without that particular ache. No low hum of what if running beneath your thoughts while you make coffee. No flinch when a stranger's face, or a song on the radio, or a random Tuesday afternoon drags an old memory back into the light. Most people carry this weight so long they mistake it for personality. They call it being hard on myself or just realistic, never realizing that the very thing they think is keeping them accountable is actually the bars of a cell they built with their own hands. Today, we're going to take those bars apart, piece by piece. This is the art of forgiving your younger self, not to excuse what happened, but to finally genuinely be at peace with it. The hidden weight of yesterday. Think about the phrase, should have. Two small words. And yet strung together across a lifetime, they form one of the heaviest sentences a human mind can construct. I should have left sooner. I should have said something. I should have known better. Each one feels small in isolation. But regret rarely visits once. It accumulates decade after decade until a person is carrying not one heavy stone but an entire quarry, strapped to their back, present at every family dinner, every quiet morning, every moment that was supposed to be simple. This isn't just poetic language. When the mind returns again and again to an unresolved failure, it activates the same threat response system your body uses for present-day danger. Cortisol rises. The nervous system stays primed, as though the danger is still unfolding. Over years, that low-grade, repeated activation takes a toll not just emotionally, but on the very system responsible for memory, focus, and resilience. A mind that is constantly relitigating 2004 has less bandwidth for the sharpness, calm, and clarity it needs in the present. What feels like simply thinking about the past is biologically closer to reliving a low-level emergency over and over. For years, traded to it physically. Imagine a backpack you started filling the day you made that first mistake you still can't shake. Every year you didn't resolve it, you added another stone, a harsh word you never apologized for, an opportunity you were too afraid to take, a version of yourself you're embarrassed to remember. By now the backpack is so heavy you've stopped noticing you're wearing it. You've simply adjusted your posture around the weight, calling the resulting ache just how I am instead of recognizing it for what it actually is. Decades of unprocessed shame, calcified into identity. Why does the mind do this? Why, out of thousands of memories, does it seem to reach for the worst ones on repeat? It isn't a personal failing, it's an old survival mechanism. The human brain evolved to weight negative experiences more heavily than positive ones, because in a more dangerous world, remembering the tiger in the grass mattered more than remembering the beautiful sunset. That ancient wiring doesn't know the difference between a predator and an awkward conversation you had at 26. It simply flags anything painful as important. Revisit this, and so it does, again and again, long after any lesson has already been learned. So here is the first challenge, and it's a deceptively simple one. Name it. Not in the abstract specifically. Somewhere in your memory is one moment, one decision, one version of yourself that still causes a physical reaction when it surfaces. A tightening in the chest, a flush of heat in the face. A sudden need to change the subject even in your own head. Find that one memory. Don't judge it yet. Don't try to fix it yet. Just notice that it's there and notice that your body still responds to it as though it happened yesterday. That noticing is where the real work begins. The anatomy of chronic regret. If a single regretful thought is a splinter, chronic regret is closer to a wound that never got the chance to close, reopened every time you touch it. And touching it becomes automatic, a groove worn so deep into your thinking that your mind falls into it without permission, the way a river always finds the same bend in the land. Persistent shame doesn't stay confined to the memory it started with. Left unresolved, it starts to color how you interpret everything else. A small mistake today gets filtered through the lens of an old, larger one. So a minor stumble suddenly feels like proof of some permanent character flaw. Decision-making becomes cautious to the point of paralysis, because some part of you is still trying to protect against a wound from decades ago. Even memory itself becomes selective. The mind, primed to expect failure, starts collecting evidence for it, while quietly discarding the moments that would contradict the story. This is how a single mistake in your 20s can end up shaping your decisions in your 70s. Not because the event itself was so catastrophic, but because it was never actually resolved, only repeated. There's an important distinction here, and it's one most people never learn to make. The difference between reflection and rumination. Reflection asks a question and eventually finds an answer. It sounds like, what happened? What did I learn? How do I carry that forward? It has a beginning, a middle, and crucially an end. Rumination, on the other hand, asks the same question on an endless loop, without ever landing anywhere. It sounds like, why did I do that? Why was I so stupid? How could I have let that happen? Repeated with no resolution, because the goal was never actually resolution. The goal, somewhere along the way, became punishment. And punishment that never lifts stops being a lesson. It becomes a life sentence for a crime that, in most cases, was really just being young, scared, uninformed, or in over your head. In the present moment today in 2026, with the life you've actually built since then, that endless loop no longer serves any function. It doesn't protect you. It doesn't prepare you. It simply drains you. And this is where the deeper psychological trap reveals itself. Somewhere in the repetition, you stopped seeing your younger self as, well, yourself. You started seeing them as someone else entirely, a separate, flawed character who embarrasses you by association. You talk about them the way you'd talk about a stranger who did something regrettable. I can't believe I did that. Notice the distance in that sentence. Not I did something I've learned from, but I can't believe I. That framing turns your past into a foreign country and turns you into someone who has to keep apologizing for a citizen you disown but can never actually deport. As long as your younger self remains a stranger to be blamed rather than a part of your own story to be understood, peace will stay just out of reach, bridging the gap through time travel. So, how do you close that distance? Not by excusing what happened, and not by pretending it didn't matter. You close it by changing your vantage point, by stepping outside the memory entirely and looking at it from a wider angle than the one you've been stuck in for years. Psychologists sometimes describe this as accessing your observing self, the part of you capable of watching your own experience unfold rather than being consumed by it. Most people, when they revisit an old regret, do so from inside the memory, reliving the panic, the shame, the confusion, exactly as it felt in the moment. The observing self does something different. It steps back the way you might watch a scene in a film rather than star in it, and asks a far more useful question than how could I have done that? It asks, what did that person actually have access to in that moment with that information, that fear, that history? This is where real perspectives to form. The you who made that decision 20 years ago did not have the wisdom you're using right now to judge them, because that wisdom was quite literally built afterward, often built because of the very mistake you're punishing them for. It's a strange kind of unfairness we commit against ourselves, holding an earlier version of you accountable for not possessing knowledge you hadn't earned yet. You wouldn't expect a first-year apprentice to work with the skill of a master craftsman. Yet somehow we expect our younger selves to have known, felt, and chosen exactly as we would today, with everything we've since survived. Try reframing the failure itself. Right now, at this point in your life, you carry certain instincts, a sharper read on people, a clearer sense of your own limits, a quieter kind of confidence. Where do you think that came from? Rarely from the moments that went smoothly, almost always from the moments that didn't. That painful decision you still replay wasn't a detour from the wise person you've become. It was one of the raw materials used to build them. The lesson was extracted at a real cost. Yes, but it was extracted, and it has been quietly informing your better choices ever since, whether you've given it credit or not. Here is a practical way to put this into motion. Set aside a few quiet minutes and, in your mind or on paper, interview your younger self the way a compassionate journalist might interview someone who lived through something difficult. Not with judgment, with genuine curiosity. Ask them directly. What were you afraid of in that moment? What did you actually know and what didn't you know yet? What did you not have access to? Money, guidance, a safe person to talk to, the emotional tools to handle what was happening? Let them answer honestly, in their own voice, without you interrupting to argue or correct them. More often than not, what emerges isn't a villain who chose badly out of malice. It's a person who was frightened, under-resourced, and doing the best they could with a far smaller toolkit than the one you're holding now. You are not excusing their choice by understanding it. You are finally, for the first time, giving it context. Cultivating active self-compassion, understanding where the old wound came from, is the doorway. Walking through it requires something more active, a daily practice of choosing a different internal voice than the one you've defaulted to for years. Most of us carry an internal critic so familiar it feels like the truth rather than a habit. It narrates our mistakes in a tone we would never use with someone we loved. Imagine, for a moment, that a close friend called you tonight and confessed the exact mistake you've spent decades punishing yourself for. Would you tell them they were irredeemable? Would you list every consequence back to them in painstaking detail, the way your own mind does at 3 in the morning? Almost certainly not. You'd offer context. You'd remind them of who they were at the time. You'd tell them it doesn't define them. The work now is learning to extend that exact same voice inward, not as a one-time pep talk, but as a genuine substitute for the critic that's been running the show. This is where a small, repeatable ritual becomes powerful. Each time the old memory surfaces, and it will, because decades of habit don't vanish overnight, try a short, deliberate practice of release rather than immediate suppression. Acknowledge it plainly. Yes, that happened. I made that choice. Don't minimize it, and don't spiral into it either. Then, consciously add the second half of the sentence, the old pattern always left out, and it does not get to define who I am today. Say it even if you don't fully believe it yet. Especially if you don't fully believe it yet. Belief tends to follow repetition far more often than it precedes it. Over weeks, this small ritual starts to interrupt a groove that took years to wear down, not by force, but by simply giving your mind a new, shorter path to walk instead. There's a deeper shift happening underneath this practice, and it's worth naming directly. For years, you've likely cast yourself as the victim of your own history, someone something happened to, someone still recovering from a self they didn't choose to become. There is another role available, and it's a far more accurate one: the compassionate mentor of your own story. A mentor doesn't pretend a mistake didn't happen. A mentor also doesn't stand over the person who made it, repeating the failure back to them forever. A mentor says, here's what went wrong. Here's what it taught us. Here's how we move forward differently. You have decades of hard-won experience now. Use it the way a good mentor would, not as ammunition against the person you used to be, but as the very wisdom that person's mistake helped create. Reclaiming the present peace. Every hour spent relitigating a decision from decades ago is an hour unavailable to the life actually happening around you right now. This is, perhaps, the most practical reason to do this work, not because forgiveness sounds noble, but because regret is expensive, and you have been quietly paying that bill for a very long time. Consider what becomes possible once that emotional energy is no longer being spent underground. A conversation with a grandchild, fully present instead of half distracted by an old ache. A morning walk noticed for its actual beauty, not filtered through a familiar undertone of self-recrimination. A new hobby, a rekindled friendship, A moment of laughter that isn't quietly undercut by the sense that you don't quite deserve it. None of this requires forgetting what happened. It simply requires no longer paying rent on a memory that's already been fully lived, fully learned from, and doesn't need to be revisited every single day to remain honored. There's a cognitive reward here too, and it circles back to where we started. A mind constantly cycling through old shame is, in a very real sense, a mind operating with less available capacity, like running several draining background programs on a device that's trying to do something new. Clear that fog, even partially, and what's often reported is startling in its simplicity: sharper focus, easier decision-making, a return of curiosity and motivation that regret had quietly been suppressing for years. This isn't about erasing the past, it's about recognizing that the fog around it was never actually protecting you. It was just costing you clarity you could be using for the life still in front of you. So here is the invitation, and it's less a single decision than a direction you choose to keep walking in. Your final chapters, however many years that means for you, do not have to be written in the same shadow as the ones you're trying to move past. They can be defined instead by something far more radical than most people ever attempt: genuine, active self-acceptance. Not the polished, performative kind, but the quiet, private kind, the kind that lets you think of your younger self and feel something closer to tenderness than shame. That shift doesn't erase your history, it completes it. It turns a story that's been stuck on one painful page into one you're finally free to keep writing. You've spent long enough being the harshest voice in the room for someone who was only ever doing their best with what they had. Let this be the point where that changes, not because the past deserves forgetting, but because the person you are now and the years still ahead of you deserve your full attention. Forgive the one who didn't know yet. Thank them for getting you here, and then finally let them rest.